There's well, no, I don't think they're recording. They're live streaming on Facebook.
Where is the camera?
Oh, sure, go. Quickly.
Like to speak from there and then.
Yeah, well,
Oh, isn't the laptop is
so that's yeah. So that's the other thing. We'll have to speak from the. We'll have to speak. They'll have to speak from there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's where the mic is.
Is the camera profile or front on? Just
So
what's going on?
I don't know where.
yeah, it's fine.
Oh, the camera's that's the camera.
there.
So we'll speak from here because that's where the mic is.
Can it connect? And then move around.
Yeah,
But it's pointed at that, right?
ignore the camera. I mean.
No, it's not Tudor walking across the whole room.
So weird. I understand.
Yep, so the motion. The motion before the House is this House supports the continued increase of windfall taxes on energy companies who made high profits within the period of high energy prices. And as soon as, go ahead, as soon as.
Sleep and then they can deal with it.
Good to go.
I'd like to wait just one more minute for. Yep, so we invite the Prime Minister to. It's probably not.
Great. Starting 3, 2, 1. Pretty straightforward case from opening government. We think this is a policy that is principally obligatory, that will lead to better outcomes for the poor and ultimately better long-term outcomes for investment and infrastructure for the energy sector. What is our model? We will have substantial taxes on additional profit, notice profit, not revenue. So the bottom line for companies for the additional money that they make in terms of increased prices, not the core business. So in the same way that tax and tax is bracketed based on incomes, your additional income or your additional net profit is going to be taxed. We will use these tax revenue to subsidize energy for the poor. I want to characterize in this debate why we think energy prices are currently high and why generally they're high. In the status quo, the reason why energy prices are so high is primarily because of the conflict in Ukraine. That is, there have been embargoes and action taken against Russia to not buy their oil, and therefore the supply of oil and the supply of energy has gone down, and that has led to increased prices because companies in the West know that they can charge higher prices. Why, on a level of principle, do we think that this arbitrary scarcity should be taxed? We think, one, companies don't deserve this money insofar as we think that profit is justified when you provide a better or superior service and you provide service for more individuals. The fact that you arbitrarily had scarcity and there was a global situation and actually a tragedy that led to you having an arbitrary advantage shouldn't mean that you get additional benefit from that. So insofar as companies don't deserve that money, we think they deserve to be taxed. But secondly, when do we tax? I think that we tax, especially an additional marginal tax, on those who unfairly benefit from society, and we take that tax and give it to those who are exploited. That is why we have additional taxes on the rich who are able to exploit and take advantage of society, and we give them back to the poor because those are the individuals who were exploited to support those who are rich. Insofar as that's the case, I think we justify on a two-pronged level of principle why one, companies don't deserve this money, and two, why those who are poor and exploited by these increased prices do. Insofar as that's the case, I think we need a justification from opposition why these companies deserve this money. I think any team that tries to explain why this profit is morally justified is going to lose. Yeah.
Can't fear that these companies necessarily are making extraordinary profit when you tax them. One, it's this House supports motion, and two, it's just the subset of companies who made profits in that specific period.
I'm just confused with the POIs. I think like the motion presumes that companies have made an additional profit. If they haven't in the status quo, we're happy to support a general principle of taxing companies. And to be clear, I think in the vast majority of instances, the reason why energy prices are high isn't because companies have decided to revolutionize energy and provide a better service. In the vast majority of instances, prices of energy go up because of arbitrary scarcity. And so we generally support the principle of taxing businesses when they make a large amount of profit based on that arbitrary scarcity. And we think this goes beyond energy. We're happy to support it in other instances as well. Second argument, why do we think subsidizing the poor is good? I think this is obviously a huge intuitive impact insofar as it massively increases the affordability of the poor and makes sure that people are able to afford basic necessities. I think the price of energy is probably currently one of the biggest factors that is limiting household income, and it often means that families can't put food on the table because the price of gas is so high for them to be able, no thank you, to go to work and for them to be able to function, for them to be able to heat their homes when the temperature is cold. I think at the point at which we're able to subsidize energy for those who are most vulnerable, that's a huge impact for our side of the house. To be clear, on mutual exclusivity, we think that it's quite obvious that justifying as a politician why money taken from exploitative energy companies given to the poor for the purpose of energy is probably one of the easiest policies to justify to the public to say, using this tax money for this purpose is probably the right way to go. Insofar as that's the case, any kind of opposition counterpart needs to argue why they're going to be able to get a policy that is just as quick, just as effective economically, and just as salient politically as our policy, given it's probably very, very easy for politicians to justify why this money should be spent on the poor, given that they're the ones who are most exploited and most vulnerable to these price spikes, and given that these price spikes are arbitrarily benefiting companies on the basis of scarcity. Go.
Yeah, so the extension of your principle is that you set this windfall tax at 100% because all of it's arbitrary. Do you support that?
We don't support 100% tax insofar as we think on the margin there is some additional service that the companies are having to provide, but we support like substantial, like 60 to 70% taxes for having this. But I think this is, about the general principle. I'm not that good at maths and finance, so pick whatever number you think is reasonable, and we'll go with that. Third argument: why do we think this will lead to more investment in infrastructure and lower prices in the long term? The reason for this is because at the point at which your bottom line profit is being taxed, it's in your incentive to not have as much of a profit. The way that you do that effectively as a company is often to invest in capital expenditure insofar as that that doesn't show up in your bottom line. If that's the case, it is in the incentive of energy companies to, rather than letting money go to rather than letting that money trickle down to the bottom line and then getting most of it taxed, which is a waste, to actually use that money for something that will benefit their business in the long term. What that means is investing in capital in infrastructure and investing in things that will increase the supply of energy in the long term. Secondly, I think often, and as we've characterized, the reason why energy prices are high is because of artificial scarcity. What this looks like in the real world is companies often colluding to be sole providers in certain geographical regions, such that they can charge whatever price they want in that region, because there's incentive for these companies to collude together and just kind of taper off different regions and just split them up between themselves, such that one company can benefit from the monopoly that they have in that area. The reason why that's important is because what that means is that it's in your incentive to decrease supply because you can charge a higher price for that as an energy supplying company. And insofar as demand for energy is inelastic, increasing prices will increase your profit on average insofar as the amount that your demand would decrease by is offset by the amount of your price increase. Insofar as that's the case, I think we are able to tip that incentive insofar as the marginal benefit that you get from raising the prices is now hugely counteracted by the massive taxes imposed upon you. At that point, the superior strategy to generate more profit in the long term is to actually increase supply and be willing to take the hit on price, insofar as when prices are low, the windfall tax no longer applies. Insofar as that's the case, we dramatically change the incentive for companies to create artificial scarcity and to, for example, shut down supply plants, which they've done in the past, in order to decrease supply and increase prices. At the point at which that's the case, I think you're likely to increase the supply of energy around the world and reduce prices for those who are most vulnerable. The third point here is that we think specifically the kind of capital infrastructure and capital investment that's likely to take place is going to be in renewables. The reason for that is because if you're going to allocate your money towards a certain kind of expenditure, you might as well do it towards something that you're going to get additional tax benefits from. But governments are currently offering massive benefits to companies for investing in renewables. The reason why they don't do it in the status quo is because the marginal benefit for renewables doesn't make up for the additional benefit that you can just get from price gouging customers on your core business. The way we switch that is, again, by reducing the marginal benefit of price gouging and by increasing prices, and rather increasing the benefit to companies when they actually invest in renewable energy. What are the impacts of this argument? One, I think across the line, we get reduced costs and increased supply for the vast majority of individuals, insofar as we increase the incentive of companies to, instead of increase prices as a way of maximizing revenue, to rather decrease costs and increase supply. You're likely to have increased renewables in tech on all those grounds.
Thank you, the Prime Minister, for that speech, and give the floor to the leading opposition voting is for O.
Two observations about that speech. One, they cannot model that they're going to use the excess revenues that come from this tax and funnel it into subsidizing energy for poor people, for the reason that, as CEO correctly points out in a POI, this is a support motion. Therefore, they do not get fiat to say where this money will go. Secondly, inasmuch as subsidization is likely to happen on either side of the debate, the largest margin is in instances where it is politically unpopular to justify subsidies in this instance, i.e., there are strong degrees of political opposition to such subsidies in certain instances, and therefore it is unlikely that in the most severe cases, this excess tax money that is sort of like being taxed on these companies is then going to be funneled into subsidies for certain individuals. So the relative mileage that they get out of that model, even if you think that they can do it, needs to be weighed against our more direct argument about why prices increase on aggregate on their side of the house. Three claims. One, windfall taxes increase aggregate energy prices. Two, we hasten the pace of renewable energy development. Three, why this is principally unjustified. Two broad mechanisms under this argument about why they increase aggregate energy prices. The first is that this is likely going to have a highly regressive impact because under the status quo, energies are expecting a certain degree of profit. This shifts the expectation that they have in terms of how much profit they will make and forces energy companies to adjust accordingly in four ways. One, inasmuch as they're being aggressively taxed, they need to find a way to make up for that money, and therefore they need to raise taxes elsewhere, i.e. in normal times. Two, there's an expectation that when energy prices rise again, they will be further aggressively taxed due to the aggressive nature of this tax and the political justifications that they themselves talk about. But thirdly, do not let them get away with a soft stance. No, this is a continued increase, i.e. the windfall tax increases over time to a significant extent. And what that then means is that Gov needs to defend this tax going up increasingly into the future, and therefore this tax is likely going to be disproportionately high on these companies. Why is this likely to be bad? Because what this then means is that that creates a huge incentive to raise aggregate energy prices in order to compensate for the profit hit that you are taking under this model, i.e. the very, very high tax that their model engenders. One, this then has a regressive impact. Why? Because given that individuals' demand for energy is inelastic, i.e. on both sides of this debate, you need to pay for energy, you need to do that so that like your home can function properly, people still have to pay for it. But what that then means is that when you pay for that energy at a higher price, you have less disposable income as a low income individual in order to spend money on things like bread that you need to feed yourself and your family. By contrast, why will prices be fair and reasonable under our side of the house? Because under our side, we enable higher degrees of stability. Why? Because absent a windfall tax, you know that there are going to be booms and busts in terms of the sort of like energy demand, but also different exogenous effects that are happening around the globe, i.e. geopolitical conflicts or natural disasters. There are going to be some instances in which energy prices will be naturally high, other instances in which energy prices will be naturally low. And what that then means is that you can shape your profit model in a way where you can make the prices stable over time, i.e. cross-subsidize, so that when they are higher, you can still keep the energy prices relatively low, versus under their side of the house where they become significantly higher. And the reason that price stability matters is because it has less of a regressive impact on low-income individuals. It's easier for poor families to plan, and they're not suddenly hit by a sudden price spike in their energy bill in the middle of the winter when a conflict is ongoing. But the second broad mechanism under this argument is that they actually ossify market power under their side of the house. I.e., the windfall tax is also likely to have a regressive effect on companies for the reason that larger companies are disproportionately likely to be able to weather this tax in the first place, especially given the framing that I gave you about why this tax is likely to be very large. And what this then means is that smaller energy companies are going to struggle taking the hit from this tax. And what this then means is that they risk going out of business, especially if they're a relatively small energy company in a rural area. What this then means is that inasmuch as larger companies now have more market power, they get to price fix, i.e. make prices increasingly high. And the reason that this is likely is because larger companies know that they can gain from a significant extent, versus under our side of the house, when you have a higher degree of sectoral competition, that is when all of the benefits that we point out, i.e. of not only price stability, but also competition between these different companies kick in when smaller companies aren't crowded out to an unnecessary extent under the status quo. And this matters for the reason that this is the most intense impact in this debate. Maybe teams can give you really like nebulous economic jargon about what's going to happen in this round, but the clearest impact is always going to be, will you be able to put bread on the table? Will you be able to survive the winter when your government can't do anything for you otherwise? And that is why we will take this debate. Before I move on, CG.
Given the tax is on profit, not income, regardless of if the oil is cheap for the company or expensive for the company, we're taxing their profit. So if they can inflate the prices all they want, they will just get more tax taken off them.
No, but that doesn't apply to our case, because still you are likely going to increase energy prices under your side of the house. Like, I don't see how that meaningfully engages with our case. Secondly, windfall taxes slow the transition to renewable energy. There are existing incentives that make a green energy transition likely. The first is that when you're able to make more money under our side of the house, i.e. your profit is higher, you're also able to cross-subsidize into clean energy. And that's for the reason that shareholder activists are able to make specific arguments on corporate boards, i.e. shareholder activists at BP, making the persuasive argument that even if you take a short-term L right now, in the long term, you can invest into renewable or cleaner forms of energy, or engine one going green for similar reasons. But a windfall tax obviously obviates this goal. Why? Because firstly, windfall taxes cut down energy profits even in times where prices are relatively low. Two, you use the spare money you make during the times where you use the spare money that you make under our side of the house in order to reinvest into green energy. But that is much more difficult to do under their side of the house. But thirdly, it's just harder to make the persuasive argument to adopt things like green energy to the same extent, because you know that you will be continuously taxed. Even if you make more profits, you won't be able to reap the fruits of those profits. And therefore, internally on corporate boards, it's harder for shareholders to make the argument that we should invest elsewhere. And it's more likely that you're just going to have status quo bias and keep the existing green energy models that you have. The implicit response that we hear from that speaker is that you can make capital investments on renewable energy to decrease your profits, so less of your money is taxed. Number one, lots of investments aren't made instantly. You need to negotiate, create plans, and convince other shareholders. And this isn't a decision that companies are just going to hastily make. But two, we explain how we better support renewable energy under our side of the house, in as much as now you get direct investment where it's based on a speculation about what might happen. And the reason this matters is because this is able to prevent future energy price crises, which precludes the debate, i.e. you're able to diversify your supply chains so that the need to raise prices isn't as high in the first place, but also it means that long-term we get better health for the environment and reduce reliance on foreign oil and natural gas supplies. Very promising new opposition.
Thank you. Opposition in speech, and now it's for the Deputy Prime Minister to engage the case for
Opening up, we know this is a this house supports motion. Our case does not depend on this house being a this house would motion. Rather, I want to explain to you why subsidization for the poor and reduced prices for the poor will only happen on our side for two reasons. First of all, this policy is likely going to actually in the real world end up paying for subsidies for the poor because it is uniquely easy to justify. That is to say, this additional tax is taken directly from companies which the public perceives and blames for having caused the harm of higher prices and profiteering during a period of scarcity at the expense of everyone else. It is thus very, very logical that politicians have incentives to help people who are struggling by punishing those who are contributing to the harm. So therefore, it's very likely that this money will go towards subsidizing them. But I also want to point out, it is uniquely likely going to go towards helping the poor. And the very simple reason is, on their side of the house, if they want to have subsidies for the poor, that is when they have to take it from the overall budget. That's when they have to tax everyone more. That's when you have to take money away from other things that the government spends on. You take money away from, no thank you, from defense. You have to take the money directly away from healthcare. The consequence is, it is far, far easier to justify subsidies for the poor and far more likely that you subsidize for the poor at the point when we have this tax, compared to when you are cutting healthcare, when you are borrowing more and putting your children's financial future at risk, so on and so forth. The second reason why these subsidies are uniquely effective and likely on our side of the house is the idea of time. Hasit characterized these situations for you. They are unique situations. like, for example, geopolitical situations, like, for example, natural disasters which might happen. The fact that they are unique means they require ad hoc policy to occur to be passed by governments in that time. And whilst on their side of the house, this occurs automatically at the point when, let's say, the Department of Energy determines that such a threshold has been reached. On their side of the house, the government actually has to pass a policy enacting this one-time subsidy. And the point when ultimately Congress and other governments are dealing with so many dozens of different issues, like, for example, the crisis itself, that is when you have gridlock. That's when it's going to take weeks and maybe even months to get that subsidy passed. To the end of the day, our subsidy is uniquely likely and effective because on their side, the poor will be left without energy for weeks. First of all, I want to rebut OO and talk about this idea of reducing costs. Then I want to talk about the principle, which we don't think they even address at all. First of all, on the idea of price. They believe that first of all, that this will have a regressive impact on price. I think there are a couple of responses to this. But first of all, I want to point out that as we pointed out in the model, there's a base level of profit that companies can make, even if the windfall tax exists. The point is, like, there's a guaranteed level of profit that they are able to generate. The consequence is, it's unclear why these companies feel the necessity to increase prices even more, because they are, like, at the very least guaranteed enough to be financially stable. Second of all, I want to point out that if companies jack up prices, this means that generally prices are likely to remain higher in markets for a longer period of time. And if prices remain higher, we think that is in itself a situation where companies will have to be paying the windfall tax for a longer period of time. These companies generally want the windfall tax to go away. They want prices to return to their normal level as soon as possible, far more on our side of the house than on their side of the house. And therefore, that is far more likely to look like investments to ensure that people can get more as possible. This leads me on to my next response to this. The idea here is, what is the best profit maximizing strategy for you as a company under the windfall tax? On their side of the house, it is to increase prices, because that is when every additional dollar you increase price, you get that additional dollar of profit. But on our side, because energy demand is quite inelastic, but on our side of the house, you don't want to increase the price necessarily. That's not the best strategy. By contrast, a much better strategy is to increase demand. That is to say, to increase capacity, to have people consuming more energy instead of the same amount of energy at a higher price. And in that sense, we massively improve the incentives of companies. On the next point, on the idea of cross-subsidization. So I think broadly what I understood from their argument is that because of this windfall tax, firms lose the ability, especially from small firms, they lose the ability to cross-subsidize and invest in the long run in terms of things like, for example, green energy. I want to point out that we think firms can access the kind of money to spend on both sides of the house. Most energy companies tend to be relatively large and mature companies. They also tend to have a relatively stable revenue because everyone needs energy. This means they tend to have very, very good credit ratings. They're very, very good at borrowing. They can borrow money whenever they need it. The idea is, what is their incentive to do? And on our side of the house, given that they probably can invest on both sides, they are far more likely to invest on our side of the house in the sense because they do not need to make as much profit during these times. They might as well engage in things like capital expenditure, which they can deduct against those taxes. Finally, on the idea of price fixing. Look, I want to point out that this is probably a symmetric arm, and the very simple reason is that I don't think the energy situation right now is the situation where you have small companies competing against larger ones to provide you with electricity. In most cases, the companies have a captive market because you need to have a huge economies of scale to make energy work. So generally, you only have regions with one sole provider, or maybe even two providers. So in that sense, I don't think they're going to have much competition on their side anyway. So why do we massively reduce costs? We won in 3 areas. One, we have uniquely effective and likely subsidies for the poor, which you substantiated at the start of my speech. Second of all, we incentivize investment in terms of capital expenditure being better. And third of all, we increase the incentive for companies to focus on profit by increasing demand, not price. So at the end of the day, we have more money going to infrastructure, and again, we have more money that's likely going to be going towards renewables. So finally, on the principle, look, Hasit explained to you that companies in no way or form deserve this money, or they don't deserve all of this money, and we explained, and I'm going to explain to you why that is so crucial. In the opinion of opening government, the government is only given so much power over the economy because it has the obligation to ensure fair outcomes in terms of who gets who. That is why the government has so much power. It also has a responsibility to ensure a fairness. The problem is the government could most certainly boost economic growth and overall outcomes. It could increase, for example, infrastructure and investment by policies which also increase inequality, but governments choose not to do so because they prioritize justice and fairness over maximizing outcomes and output. This is why, for example, inheritance tax is so high. It may be the case that having a low inheritance tax means rich people work harder, but overall, it's believed that it's unfair that people get this money that they don't deserve. We've proven that these companies do not deserve all of this additional profit because it wasn't provided by success in the market. Rather, it was either blind luck, but more importantly, profiting and exploiting the vulnerability of others. Energy is a necessity, and we believe that makes it unique in the sense that it's wrong for you to exploit individuals' need for energy during tough times and make so much money off their backs. So on that basis, we're very proud to propose.
So should we thank the UPenn for that speech? We can look forward to the community opposition to close up the staff.
I'll talk about three things in this speech. Firstly, on the principle, secondly, on prices, thirdly, on investments and green energy. Firstly, then, principle. The gut principle is that lots of these energy companies did not deserve the increase in profits they received due to exogenous factors such as natural disasters and war, and therefore they should be taxed on it. So there's three responses I have to this. The first is that this principle doesn't necessarily follow. Why is this true? Because what they're claiming is just that companies did not deserve this amount of profit, but the extension of this principle is no one deserved any of the profits they made using lots of arbitrary talents beyond things like operating costs. So obviously this doesn't make sense in a huge amount of cases. But given that, we need to be more morally wrong to punish companies for something that is relatively arbitrary. So on the flip, it is actually worse that you are actively doing harm to companies that didn't deserve it than for you to be like taking away things that they do not deserve. So on the balance of which side is causing more, is more likely causing moral injustice, it is their side of the house. But also, it is relatively hard to quantify how much a company deserves and does not deserve, and often that quantification on their side is highly likely going to be miscalculated. So we would rather prefer utilitarian outcomes as to whether or not individuals on ground can receive better prices and whether or not they can put food on the table. Second response, yes, fine. Yes, it's true that companies should be taxed for things they did not deserve. The answer is, the solution to this is we already tax companies that make more profits in greater amounts, not a perfect approximation, but we don't think it's completely doesn't exist right now. Thirdly, realistically, even if we concede that this principle that companies did not deserve all of the profits they make is true, our argument proves to you two worse impacts that overrides this principle and show you why this principle doesn't matter. The first is that the price hike caused by windfall taxes is worse on their side when companies don't have cross-subsidization abilities due to a greater decrease in price stability on their side. And yes, even if the money gets redistributed through taxes in the future, that is a lengthy and an inefficient process compared to just individuals holding on to that disposable income right now when they know what they need to spend that money on right now. It's unclear whether governments can properly approximate what the individual need is versus the individual who probably knows what they need better, and therefore within that time gap, they actually lose lives when that money doesn't get into the pockets of people, especially when some of these governments are not the cleanest spenders, relatively corrupt, or in some cases, just really bureaucratically full of nonsense. So that's the issue they have to deal with on their side. No, thank you. Secondly then, let's talk about increase in prices. Matt explains to you very clearly how energy companies operate when it comes to profit expectation and why they have to adjust on their side of the house. But the issue is how often these companies adjust poorly. Often they either misproject or they have to overcompensate early on in order for them to pursue the future harms of windfall taxes being implemented. The biggest question is from CG, which is no, but when you price hike, more of that money goes into tax money, so the company won't price hike in the first place. Otherwise, all that money will get taxed in the future anyway. One, this is like sound logic, but the issue with this claim is that there's a collective action problem among oil taxing companies. So even if it is true that companies like the money, the extra profit they make will get taxed, here's why they still have to keep prices relatively high. Because it is unpopular and difficult to massively lower your prices because OPEC probably realizes that it is really hard and difficult to justify in the future why you are going to increase or keep prices high. It is also extremely politically politically unpopular in the future to raise prices, than for you to set the expectation that the price is relatively high already and force individuals on the ground to deal with it. Especially when on both sides of the house, governments are likely to subsidize things like energy buying. Why? Because often people need energy to survive. It is a major voting issue, CF the EU energy crisis. So regardless of what the price is, governments are likely going to be providing this for people or providing subsidies to ensure that people can afford it because people really care about it. But two, even if you buy this claim at its highest, our argument will be that people can better control the use of their disposable income, that the government can make decisions and make this redistribution process over this money. Why? Because you know your needs probably much better than the government can, i.e. whether you have to put that money into things like food, to education, or to saving your sick mother. Therefore, it's better if more of that money is kept in your pockets than relying on the government to determine what policy they want to implement and how, in what ways, and to who, which groups they want to distribute the money to. But three, if you are both taxed but also can't price hike, so for example, smaller companies, this feeds into our argument about monopolization, when small companies eventually go out of business because they are both aggressively taxed, but also are unable to make these compensations. So the companies that remain are often going to be large companies that monopolize and are able to afford it on their side of the house. And that's really bad because in a lot of cases, some of these small companies are the sole providers in relatively more rural regions where individuals need the energy the most and the individuals that rely on these companies the most. So that's the issue. Stop badgering. And so this is the problem that they have to deal with. But also, by the way, we have received no response from OG. The last thing they say is that this tax also taxes but also note, this tax taxes the additional demand that people have for the energy. So we're not sure what the issue is on their side. We'll take opening.
If it is the case, as Aldo says, that this tax rate is very high, companies don't benefit at all by raising prices, but rather increase revenue by keeping costs low so they can keep more of their profit.
I literally explained to you why there's a need for companies to some level keep the prices high because there's a collective action problem amongst not only tax but also companies. But also I'll prove to you why we have better investment from that side of the house in the second. Moving on to the OG response. The OG response is the tax goes to subsidizing the poor because it is really easy to justify. So this is a shift from their funny ass model where you can just this claim. First thing, due to the history of communism, people generally view things like subsidies as overly socialist and therefore it's relatively hard to justify it. But two, you don't believe this, fine. Here are reasons why subsidies for these poor is probably symmetric. Why? Often, being able to afford fuel and being able to cook and be warm in the winter is a relatively important voting issue, if you ask me. I feel like most individuals probably care about whether or not they're able to live. Therefore, it is highly likely on both sides of the house, the governments that do care are going to be putting money to subsidizing energy issues. The governments that don't care on their side of the house are going to leave these individuals to die versus on our side, individuals at least have the disposable income on their own. Moving on to energy very quickly. All claims that to not have profit, you need to make green investments and invest in capital infrastructure so that's what that money gets taxed. One, there's a time issue. You often need a long time to get investments into green energy approved, even under a speedy and efficient negotiation process. Why? Companies need to know when you where you're putting certain things, what your long-term plan is for developing into the green infrastructure. All of that needs time, but now that this policy is time sensitive, it actually further increases companies' incentive to just price gouge on their existing energy and oil supplies, which actually worsens energy transition on their side of the house. Also, it doesn't make sense. Part of your profits during crisis is also profits you make from people using your renewable energy. So we said it's still hard to make the argument that you should just funnel this money onto their side of the house. Compared to our model, your crop subsidization is less uncertain. It's less dependent on things like political winds, and it's also, versus on our side, significantly more predictable, which leads to more sustainable development.
Created proposition and now from member of suffrage and it's procedure.
Problem for opening opposition is there was a world before the conflict where companies were able to cross-subsidize with the profits that they previously had, were able to exist under the same financial strictures that we wanted to send them back to, the strictures of 3 years ago. And we think that they can do that perfectly fine, and it is unclear why the situation as currently is, which is not the one that is characterized by top half in a minute, is not one that enables us to move back to a place where, look, you can make profits on what you previously were charging people, and you're making profits perfectly fine, and that is few pieces of rebuttal. Firstly, they say that if you charge super high rates, so we say even if we charge super high rates, and even in the closing opposition model of 100%, there's literally no incentive to charge more mental rates. Opening up and sorry, assert this. Here's why. Look, if I'm selling a unit of thing for $100 and I can make profit on the first $30 of that, or I can sell that unit of thing for $30 and make profit on the $30 of that, I want to sell more of the thing up to that $30 and being able to sell it to the consumer, who is the person who is ultimately making that, whether that's a person in their house, whether that's a business, is the thing that is going to be determining that and driving up the usage rates. And at that point as a business, it literally doesn't matter to me what the additional sort of price I'm charging is, if that profit isn't something that I can then go on and use. If it is something like if I have to sort of reinvest back into my business, we're going to give you reasons as to why you're likely to invest that into greener technologies, why that is beneficial in a minute. Second thing, they talk about cross-subsidizing. Like I think that this has literally been fine forever, and energy companies have already been able to do this. We are taxing the windfall. We are not increasing this to 100% tax on all profits. It's on the windfall. Previously, these companies have been able to sufficiently cross-subsidize. Shell CEOs have been able to have as many private jets as they like. They've been able to make as many billions of pounds in profit and still exist. It is unclear why in 2023 they need these windfall profits in order to cross-subsidize coming out of opening bonds, as opposed to their standard profits that we might otherwise have expected them to get. They don't say government's going to subsidize in the long run. Firstly, we think this is literally not true. They didn't before. But it's also just unclear why this has to be true in the long run. Secondly, that is not what we're standing for in proposition. You can say that governments might subsidize it in the long run. We would rather they didn't, and we think they won't on the side opposition. They lastly say that there's a collective action issue, which means that you need to keep prices higher if you're a business. I think the way to solve that collective action issue is to collectively tackle utilities. Cool. The situation at the minute, panel, is where government support is starting to wind down to people and to businesses because it is costing tens of billions of pounds. It has literally tanked one UK Prime Minister and is continuing to tank economies more broadly because it is costing too much to support people through the current situation. But wholesale oil prices have returned to pre-conflict levels. The point here is that whilst this support is still coming from government, it is effectively subsidizing these large oil companies and these large energy companies currently. They are selling, or they are buying in the oil for a certain price and then selling it on for the price we would like them to sell it on for, plus the massive government subsidy that they're already getting. This comes on specifically to the principal clash within this debate. So opening government say it's unexpected. And therefore, it's not really legitimate. I think the DLA response to this is particularly strong. The actual principle we say in closing government is this. Throughout the onset of the conflict, states massively bailed out energy companies, have essentially bankrolled them indirectly through the energy price guarantee, both to consumers and to companies who are in order to manage their unit prices. The government now has a duty to recoup from this industry what has previously been doled out. The question for CO is how they want to go about recouping these previously doled out billions and billions of pounds. The assumption so far we're getting from opening opposition is they actually don't care about recouping at all. Given the maintenance of high prices forces people into needing public services more because they have to spend more money on energy and therefore needs don't have that money to spend on other things, that forces them more to quality and institution and demanding. And that further increases reliance on government services. We think it then makes it harder for government to provide these services because you're needing to provide more. This is, we think that we solve it by making energy cheaper, not forcing people towards that, but also by taking literally tens of billions of pounds back across the sector, even just within the UK more broadly. Environmental stuff. Opening governments say that there's some marginal price gouging mechanism. We think there are a couple of stronger mechanisms. Firstly, we get new competitors into the market. Opening government currently say that there are big oil companies on Here's the comparative. On proposition, we think it is easier to be a smaller competitor relatively as a company in the green energy market for three reasons. One, firstly, we think it is a less mature market with less large competitors already. Secondly, we think there are lots of government incentives for people to enter that market. Thirdly, we think that there's less infrastructure needed to build a windmill than there is to become a massive oil producer. Second thing, we also think this incentivizes these companies to create subsidiary companies that they can then invest money into instead, where that infrastructure already exists. We think that this is more likely to happen because you're more likely to get this investment into green energy because non-green energy is much more finite. But we also think there exists energy transmission and infrastructure, so it's fairly straightforward to literally whack in some windmills into the North Sea. In opening opposition, they say that this takes time. We say that we accelerate this status quo for businesses who are currently already in that market, and that is particularly good. I'll come on to why this is a good mechanism.
Even if Shell was doing just fine before the crisis, our point was that the way you get through to conservative shareholders is by saying, let's use the windfall now and in the future to invest into renewables versus standard profits which go into energy extraction.
We should massively encourage in the future and do it for all, to do it right now and for all companies. I'm really quite unclear why it is that given these people currently are buying energy at a pre-conflict level, pre-conflict rate, they need to be making this particular market. I don't think that was particularly proven for the incentive analysis that you have. Why is this mechanism going to shift to green? We think it is easier to bring. We think that the reason why shifting to green is particularly impactful is that it massively increases energy securities. You get more companies and more investment within your own national domestic industries. We think at the point where the conflict is over, this means that you do not have to regress back to either pre-conflict energy usage of Russia or other countries where there could be foreseeable energy security issues, because you're able to foster a domestic and green energy market. We also think that this means that you have a greater ability in the long run to maintain a level of market regulation in case of exactly the kinds of shocks that opening opposition wants to talk about. So if you do then have the energy price spikes that I think about, you're able to be in a position where you can regulate it more effectively, so domestic companies can be trying to understand it.
Sorry, Zarina's just gone to the toilet because she's a bit sick. But she'll return and I shall dispatch from one eye.
This is when you run a surprise case.
Yeah.
I did like so when Aniket stood up and said.
Yeah. I'm gonna wait. I'm just moving my notes over there. Yeah.
More funny if she did guess what you said through my speeches. Yeah. I would be more enthusiastic. I'm just very tired. But yeah.
I can hear Tim next door. Wow, that's funny.
Does it sound like
The bulb is the way we do windmills.
This is your speech, like, isn't it? Like.
Like say lines from my speech already. You're telling him lines from my speech.
We're not gonna do that. Don't worry.
Sorry.
So thank you to the member of government and the advising member of office.
So I want to be very clear about what the motion says, because I think that particularly top half have kind of missed what the debate is or should be about. And I'm glad that closing government brought in the current context and what's actually going on in the world. But we're just going to flip that and explain why it leads to essentially a bunch of good companies failing. We're going to actually fill in the links on renewable energy as well. We talk about, inequality of investment in various countries. So the motion says that we are taxing the windfall of companies that made excess profits in the previous 2 periods of time, and we're taxing them now and increasing that. That is the continued, to increase of the taxation of companies that have previously made this profit. That is what is in the debate, right? So that's what this debate is about. Essentially, we agree with closing government that yes, these prices are going down now, but you're increasing taxation on these companies and taking more and more of their revenue. And the justification is that they made a huge windfall in the previous 2 periods. So I want to be very clear about why companies, therefore, are probably going to be unable to pay this taxation. There are a few different reasons I want to note here. The first is that oftentimes with this excess taxation, the way it works is that oil companies and energy companies have long-term contracts for oil. So what they do is they buy oil 2 years before they pass it on, for example, because it's a resource that doesn't go away and you want to hedge into the long term. But what that means is that now, this is when companies are going to have to renegotiate those contracts because it's 1 or 2 years down the line from what it was previously, which means that they're now going to have to pay far higher prices on this oil, so they're going to face extremely high costs at the moment. But secondly, the windfalls that companies had previously have now been invested into things like green energy and renewable technology, which I'll go into in my second section. So that means they have far less money with which to pay this. But thirdly, we would say that in many markets, governments regulate energy prices to link them to global prices which are falling because, there's a supply chain shift from Russia whereby Europe gets lower energy from the USA, for example. And also Russia now floods energy to countries that aren't sanctioning it, like, for example, South Africa or India. And what that means is that the energy price now has gone down. So again, companies don't have the capacity to pay this. And what that means is that profit is unlikely to be crazy high or abnormal during the period where there's continued windfall tax implemented. And they'll say, oh, we won't tax it because it's a windfall, but it's a support motion. The question is, how does this likely happen? The likely justification is that, as I'll get into, politicians stand up and are like, oh, these companies are arseholes. They've just taken all money away from people. They're terrible. They have the huge amounts of capacity to now pay in the current period, which is wrong for all the reasons I've said. I know why they're banging, but rebutting the whole case. Right, so how is this taxation level set then? Governments demonize energy companies as profiteering off the public to push through these taxes. They use things like the populist rhetoric that we heard essentially of opening government, which is that everyone is struggling in these high inflation periods, and so it's easy to demonize all companies as a result. And it's true that companies did make high profits, but as we have explained, those profits have massively reduced, and that money has already been reinvested, and so it's therefore impossible for these people to pay. But also there's a kind of competition that exists here, where in terms of states that have nationalized energy, it's far easier to justify. So essentially what happens is that this gets normalized to a large extent, as well over time, because governments use it as a tool. It's essentially very easy for them to justify taxing these companies. You say we're going to eat the rich or whatever, we're going to use closed tax loopholes or whatever. And what that means is that these taxes are necessarily, in the likely scenario, set at an extremely unsympathetic level, unfairly, and they probably will eat into normal profit, because the point is they're happening now when companies are making relatively normal profit rather than previously. And this continues beyond the current market conditions in the period. That exists right now and happens in the long term. The impacts, I think, are very clear. A lot of good companies who are just decent energy providers are obviously out of business because they have to pay this huge increased cost of the tax as well. But I want to link in a second. I want to link this directly to renewable energy and extend on this far more. Because opening opposition have the correct headline, but I think the reasoning they give is slightly flawed, which essentially the ESG implies that the money goes here. We're going to fill in a few burdens. Firstly, why companies do this instead of things like shareholder buybacks. Secondly, why we're going to deal with the writing off response coming out of opening government. Thirdly, we're going to explain why governments don't invest in renewable technology, which interacts directly with closing government. And lastly, we're going to explain why you need this level of excess profit in order to get this. The opening opposition reason is ESG essentially, and that's definitely true. It's like ethical investing, and that's definitely true to some extent. But for that case to work, that requires proving that the majority of people within this company on the board are ESG investors. They do care about this. We think something different, which is that it is just rational for companies to do this. Because the way that their share price is determined is by long-term pricing, right? The cumulative present value of the company, which exists indefinitely into the future. And also the average shareholder, as some people like pension funds, for example, who have very long-term incentives because they need to ensure that the people who they're managing money for get a pension like 40 to 50 years. So they are extremely long term. They care massively about the long term, regardless of who they're, if they have ethical direct things as well, but also the egos of individual CEOs who want to engage in green technology. And I think that's a far stronger set of reasons than just that some of these investors are quite ethical. Before I go on, okay.
If these companies invested all their profits into CapEx, that's tax deductible. Why would these companies be taxed for money they don't have?
It's not tax, but this is like a level of nuance, right? Tax deduction and so on. We actually show that this happens in an extremely populist way. And so the way this tax is implemented is deeply problematic. You can't just say that we get to have this best possible version of the tax. You need to engage in the likely scenario, which we've shown is bad. But and the response is tax deductibility. But we say again, the tax by the first extension is going to be so high that essentially you have no profit with which to engage in this. Now, the next thing I want to do is talk about why governments can't do this, because that's the closing government push, is that governments will invest in green technology instead. We think that governments don't do this for a few different reasons. The first is they're far more willing to engage in actual dirty energy, right? Because the main thing that matters for a government is a long-term success of that thing in 20 to 30 years. It's ensuring that energy prices are low at the minute. You have an election that's right around the corner. And so you don't really care about where that energy is necessarily coming from. You just ensure that it exists to some extent. So you embrace things like LNG if you're Germany, because even though the Green Party is in government at that period of time, because you need that energy to make up for it. So that's why you embrace that kind of dirty energy as well. But also we say that governments are far more short-termist because they don't have the same kind of long-term reason we're talking about. So what that means is that governments don't invest in real energy, in green energy, but these companies do. And we think they need an excess degree of profit because very obviously that means enables them to engage in far more bets about real energy that are all kind of speculative. So you are able to invest in a far greater variety of green tech overall, and that's a good thing. But the last thing is, even in their best case, we think this is still problematic, because it leads to more inequality, because the tax is implemented in countries where these energy companies are based, rather than their global subsidiaries. So this country now gets far more of the revenue, whereas companies previously had incentive to invest globally, because that is how they're best able to maximize profits. So for all these reasons, very proud to do this.
We thank the member of opposition for that speech and now give the floor to the member of government with the
Ready? Okay, dealing with CO, dealing with our principle rather than OG's principle, and then taking two things on this. CO, yes, okay, in theory, maybe oil companies buy 2 years in advance, 1 year in advance, don't really care. And I understand the case, which is ultimately they might fail or they might struggle. 3 things on this. First of all, given most pension funds, banks, and things like that are tied up in oil prices and oil stocks, because most pension funds are tied up in what are considered stable monetary income companies or projects, oil and energy traditionally being something that a lot of banks and a lot of pensions have sunk their money into. It seems highly unlikely that the government would do what Aniket says. Like, it is correct that in this motion we have to talk about likelihood of how this policy is going to be implemented. CEO's contention is that it will be done in a populist way. I think most governments at the moment who are under a cost of living crisis, who are in a situation, as Jack says, where we don't have enough money to put back into our welfare systems, are highly unlikely to ever push this policy to the point of breaking that Aniket claims. Why so? Because at the point where they push these companies to either fail, this fucks over the pensions, this fucks over the banks, and it means that the next recession or the current recession we're in goes on even longer, even worse, hurts all the people that Jack and I don't want to hurt and the governments don't want to hurt. I'll talk about that a little more. Or it means that they're even unlikely to push these companies to the point where they're struggling, where it is a realistic risk. So what I mean there is, it's not that they won't push them until they're to breaking point. They won't push them until they don't have sufficient pool of profits. So this government is still likely to keep oil companies having a level of profit, i.e. likelihood analysis and justification as to why Jack's perception of the world, where we allow these companies to have the amount of profit they used to make, we just don't allow them to absolutely take the piss in the time of an income crisis. Yes, you said the top sentence, you didn't give the analysis, stop banging the table. Two things on this. I think secondly, another reason it is unlikely we are to live in the world of CO is these companies are ultimately too big to bust. I really enjoyed Aniket's perception of these really nice, struggling, small mom and pop shop energy companies. I don't know who the fuck they are. Like, I don't think it is likely that Shell is ever likely to get to the point where they're that desperate and that in need of support, right? Even that we put up with oil companies and energy companies doing kind of crappy things to the oceans, to their customers, to things like that, is ultimately something that the world needs. And they're unlikely, this government policy is unlikely to ever be implemented in a way that complete populist implementation happens. Yes, it is a cross-voter issue, but so too are pensions, being able to heat your house, being able to run your car, being able to run your tractor that gets the food to the people, the trucks that get the food to the people. So in a cost of living crisis, in a world in which a recession is likely to last for fucking ever, I just don't see the likelihood analysis that closing opposition standing up to the real world. Okay, let's talk about our principle, right? That is correct insofar as the state has bankrolled ultimately an industry throughout both, to an extent, COVID, but mainly Ukraine crisis and various environmental crises that have fucked over both the supply chain and indeed just where we can and cannot get our oil and energy from. What does this mean? It means that the principle we stand over in proposition and definitely in closing government is that there is a duty to recoup as much of those funds without crippling these companies. What does that mean? It means that the government now is able to use that money, regardless of whether it's OG's version of the world where it 100% without analysis goes into the poorest people's pockets. It definitely goes into the state's coffers. What does that mean? It means that they're able to fight to recoup the deficit they have put into this industry, to allow this industry some sort of a safety net through a hard time. It is therefore legitimate, opening opposition, for us to do this. It is legitimate insofar as they've received a safety net from the government. Their duty is to now allow that safety net to be passed on to someone else. What does that mean and why is that likely? It means that either it is passed, it ensures that states are able to tackle the money they lost and mean that their deficit is not as high, or it means they're able to support other sectors that have been impacted throughout both the pandemic and just people's inability to travel and things like that, like the hospitality service, or just insert any industry that has been massively fucked over in the last 3 years. Finally, it means that if everyone in opposition cares so much about like your granny's ability to pay her heating bill, what is more important to your granny is not necessarily whether the oil company is doing all these economic safeguardings that opening opposition talks about. What's more important is that the state is stable enough and able to either, as Jack tells you, fund your welfare and ensure that you're not as reliant, ensure that you're not as reliant on state services as you will be if you can't afford to feed yourself, feed your home, etc. I will take you at the end of this point. It is more important to her that the state functions, that the state is able to recoup, and that this weighing therefore I think takes us over. Oh, but I'll do a little bit more after
So to be clear, the only country that really engaged in these subsidies to the extent that you're talking about is the UK, because we had trust who was incompetent. Countries of Europe, for example, engaged in a price cap system where they didn't directly fund these
That
companies.
is not fucking true. The Irish government did it as part of an EU policy. Like, I'm sorry. It was supported across so many EU countries. It was also done in a lot of Latin American countries. Yes, not to the ridiculous extent your terrible government did it, but there still was a level of support. There was equally a level of support insofar as they didn't have to pay, even if they weren't given direct money from the state's coffers, they were given essentially money by not having to pay certain forms of taxes or certain forms. It's the exact same, maybe they didn't hand them as much money as your government did, but like fact claim, I just don't think it would connect. Okay. Next thing, I think that this becomes, when it comes to green energy and the green energy debate, I think this is the way in which we can justify having companies actually invest in green energy themselves, rather than forcing the government to have to do it long term. Why is this the case? At the point where you are likely to have to recoup these costs, it becomes now that you need to invest in either new forms of energy that become less expensive long term because they are less likely to be taxed as highly, or you're likely to get benefits. But secondly, it's just that the customers are more willing to engage with them, are more capable of engaging with them in a world where there isn't a massive recession and people are not able to maybe spend that little bit more on implementing solar panels, etc. themselves and engaging with you as a company in that way. Finally, on how this microphone really annoying, I'm sorry. Finally, on how companies are able to ensure that they get profit long term. Jack is correct, which is to say that if you can only get, say, 30 quid worth of profit, your duty now, instead of increasing your profit, becomes having a good service and making sure that you get as many customers as possible. This is where we see things like energy companies actually engaging and looking after their customers, maybe not turning off the lights so much, maybe looking after people to keep their custom. I beg you to propose.
So sorry. Is it all right if I run the bathroom? Sorry.
Yeah.
But are you okay if we just start the web? Because given you can't POI it.
Yeah. Thank you.
No worries. So we can be controversial and then the opposition with chicken to this hall.
No, it's fine. It's fine. They're literally behind that thing. Yeah.
Just ready? We'll start the speech in 3, 2, 1. The word continued is a funny thing because you only need to believe 2 things for us to have won this debate. Number one, that looking at the market as it is now, companies, when you continue to apply a model of windfall taxes, are unlikely to be making the types of profits which would have historically been the basis and justification for those taxes, but don't warrant those taxes right now. You see, government has to support continuing it. But number 2, the way that these taxes are likely to be applied, as Aniket proved in 5 reasons, which I will repeat because I responded to, means that you are likely to get an unfair level of taxation, which will actually erode into companies' normal profits. And by normal profits, I don't mean the money that they used to make. I mean the money that they need to sustain their businesses in the future, given that with the windfall taxes, they did things, as Aniket said, like invest more in green energy, invest in better supply chain, which means that they now have increased costs because they scaled as a result of their unexpected profit. Because as Aniket proved, there was investor pressure to do so. If you believe those 2 things, we win the debate for 2 reasons. The first is everything that opening opposition says, whether it's about consolidation or whether it's about green energy tipping points, are based on the assumption that these companies are harmed by these taxes. But the natural gut response is to say they made profits they didn't expect in the first place. So what is the tipping point for this investment? We are able to explain why, firstly, the likely comparative is that they would have invested in these good things that we all care about. But secondly, the culture which comes as a result of the way that this tax is likely to work means that they are going to be screwed over and lack the capacity to do the things that opening opposition wanted us to do. With backdrop, it's a bit more confusing, with OG it's a bit more clear, so let's just move into it. In terms of how our case works, the first thing I'll note is the reason that windfall taxes are likely to harm companies with threefold. The first reason, of course, was that the contracts that companies use, which would allow them to make record profits, where they negotiated prices 2 years before the war in Ukraine and then sold prices relative to current market rates, have expired, and therefore they are unlikely to make that spread into the future. The second reason, that they invested in various good things which come with increased operating costs. And the final thing, that these companies, no thank you, and the final thing, that the market rate going down means that there is less scope in countries where the prices are priced by the market rate for them to make that profit. The reasons that we gave as to why this is likely to be done badly then was several-fold. The first reason is the demonization which has come from the fact that people are struggling due to high inflation. The fact that the perception is that these companies did make high profits, and this is objectively true and well reported. The fact that some states like France nationalized their energy industries and therefore mitigated the price increase. So governments themselves have a pressure to prove that they are able to do something radical to the energy companies. The fact that governments have high interest rates, increasing tax burdens, and need cash for things like their pensions obligations. The fact that this just becomes normalized as a political tool to promise to fund stuff in the same way that closing tax loopholes was in vogue and led to bad tax loopholes being implemented because it's in vogue. I want to weigh this against the counters that we got in the government speech. The first thing we hear is that pension funds are invested in and they heavily invest in oil. So governments are unlikely to set the price and tax in a high way. The problem is, this ignores several things. The first is the volume of mechanization that we gave you as to why the likely comparative is one where they set things in bad ways and the precedent for that. But the second and more important thing that this ignores is the fact that the fact that the investment that these companies have or that these pension funds have is not the predominant thing which affects government decision making. It is how easy it is to sell the narrative. It is how angry people would be if their policy that they have in their head, the obvious easy policy of windfall taxes, are not implemented. It is the harm of losing the election if you don't implement it. It is the comparisons of other countries which constantly occurs. So if you have to weigh what is the most likely conception of this policy, it is the one that we explain, because it is not practical consideration, but predominantly thinking of these politicians, and the short-term incentives that Aniket tells you about are the reasons why they are likely to trend towards this, and the actual impacts can become the next government's problem, and you can demonize them for all that. Before I explain what the implication of this is for the round, I'll take closing.
If your list of reasons as to why you think they made a lot of profit and that governments invested in it is true, and the wording of the motion is true as to they made high profits, do you think your other point is true, that companies invested so much in green energy that they are now at risk of defaulting? Only half of your case can stand.
Yeah, okay. Let's do the same thing about this idea of defaulting. To win this debate, we don't need to prove that mom and pop shops default. We don't need to prove that like oil companies go bust. This is about the profit in and of itself being a good thing, because we demonstrated that structurally they invested it in good things, and we would like them to continue to use their more normalized profit in the future to invest in good things. So the impact that we're proving in this debate is not that these companies are going bust. It's not as reliant on consolidation as open opposition's mechanisms were. It is that they use their record profits to do good things. We support that. They have higher costs into the future as a result of that. That is unfortunate, but we also support that trade-off. And it is bad that the culture which is likely to occur on their side of the house will prohibit them from using their future normal profits to be able to invest further in the things that we prove they are structurally likely to do, which are good. I think weighing all of this up, is easy to see why we win this debate for a number of reasons. Firstly, comparing to closing government's duty to recoup. One thing to say is that most companies didn't just throw money at energy companies. Liz said, no, this isn't true. One, Liz Truss did this. She was a member of the oil lobby. Two, the USA did nothing because they had other streams of oil revenue and income, so they didn't bother to try and fix market prices. Two, many countries just implemented price caps. Three, many countries just gave cash directly to individuals, right? Because other costs were going up as well. I just don't get why the duty to recoup exists in every situation, even if they're able to prove why in the context that they wanted to talk about, they do. But secondly, this assumes that you get exactly the same amount back as you tax. But if you believe our point on the culture of taxation and how this is likely to be used in the future, this is not true. So they're not fulfilling the tax obligation that these companies were given via subsidies by taxing them by this mechanism. But finally, as I proved, these companies spend money on objectively good things like investment into green energy. We think that matters more than the duties to recoup, because that's why governments give people shit to do good things, and prove that they do good things, versus opening government. If you believe their principle, then we should just tax these people 100%. I think we've proven that this is far more realistic, and we'd be an open conversation by proving that. We win the debate as a result.
Thank you, with that today, that's each. We the second debate, we must and then in the room,
Tutor, I might not come back to the OA because I feel. Thanks.